Thanks very much, everyone, for coming back, and people who haven't come back have just come. Thanks very much indeed. So this is the second of two talks which we've had today, which have kindly been hosted by, as part of the Digital Design Weekend, by Mark Bartow, who's the curator, and the V&A more generally. And the last talk focused on kind of ecological metaphors around the internet and looking at the kind of concerns and the sort of status of play now and how we got here, and tentatively suggesting maybe not some solutions, but some strategies for trying to think around it. This second talk is based around the idea of using craft as both a kind of a metaphor and practices to put a different lens on these concerns around the internet. If you were here before, John was suggesting we were going to crack it. I suggest we probably aren't, but hopefully there's some sort of interesting perspectives. And I think after I introduce the rest of the panel, I'll come back to some of the things that I thought I found resonance with in the last panel. So I'm Justin Marshall. I'm a professor of craft and digital making at Northumbria University. So I'm more in the maker than the creative technologist. And I've been interested in this role of digital tools within traditional craft practices for a lot of my kind of making and academic career. And I've really enjoyed working in sort of interdisciplinary teams and bringing this idea of craft ethos into projects where craft wouldn't normally rear its head. And then we've got Professor Andrew Prescott. He's an honorary fellow at the School of Critical Studies in the University of Glasgow, trained as a medieval historian, and a curator of the Department of Manuscripts at the British Library. I think, perhaps, I don't know if it's most relevant, but he was also HRC theme leader, fellow for digital transformations. That was a strategic theme for the HRC in 2012 to 2019. Said here, interests are summed up by his new title of latest publication, which is Archives, Power, Truth and Fiction. And then we have Neha Singh, who's a designer and creative director at Quicksand, which is a design and strategy innovation consultancy based in India, with a focus on emerging markets. And she's interested in sort of uncovering the depth and nuances of research contexts and translating these into insights and meaningful narratives and solutions and strategies for communities and working with communities. So, and has used craft as an inspiration for not just final products, but again, for this sort of part of the nature of a craft as a creative process. And finally, Heke van Dijk, sorry if it's a bad pronunciation, co-founder and strategy director of Standby in Amsterdam and London, and they're a long-standing design agency or organisation specialising in design research for meaningful positive change and working with international clients and industries in the public sector, with a background in ethnography, research and user-centered design and innovation management. So we are a relatively diverse team. So as I said, both these talks have come out of a research project that was funded by is funded by the HRC, with this sort of big underlying question. How do we define and foster a healthy relationship between people, the Internet of Things, using the ethos and practices of craft? And also, as we have in this panel, kind of using other knowledges as well to kind of explore that. And that's our team below. So why craft? Why are we trying to use this sort of seemingly very unrelated set of practices and traditions and thinking to map on to the concerns about the internet that were raised in the previous talk. And I think we've all kind of had knowledge of either personally and or through issues that have been raised regularly in the press, as again, if you saw the first talk, John kind of highlighted, even in a week, it encompasses a whole load of very problematic situations, from social, ecological, psychological, and general power structures. I think for me, yes, craft is a material practice, and I think, again, that's very important, but it also is a set of ethos. It's things that people often associate with craft. So I think when you think of craft, you often think of things that are bespoke, things that are looking to make things fit to a particular situation or context or person, rather than aiming at ubiquity. It's quite often about there's some sort of trusted relationship that's sort of made through this idea of an object where you know where it's come from, you know its provenance, you might know the person who's made it, and that embeds a sort of sense of trust, and also I'd say a sense of authenticity that moves beyond just the kind of the sort of proving that somebody made something, therefore it has just financial value. It goes beyond that into a much more meaningful relationship. Localism was talked about again in the first talk, and we'll return to that really important of sort of both provenance of knowing who might have made something, but also thinking about how you might engage with the resources and materials and cultures that are local in order to make things happen, rather than use the very distributed kind of model that global capitalism tends to deploy in order to produce product. And other things like recognition of being active agents in the way in which you engage with the world, rather than passive. And I think broadly I think there's a carefulness, as in a practice full of care, that a lot of people associate with craft. So that's why we thought it was interesting. I hope you can see how that kind of talks against these issues to do with lack of transparency, lack of control, an opacity, and a very potentially exploitative and, as Vladam said, a extractive kind of processes that are going on the internet now. So these are just a few of, we've tried to think about craft not as a kind of a defining set of principles, which lots of people, if anyone's in the craft community here, you know has been an ongoing, unnecessary kind of argument that people have about what you can define craft as. Is rather try thinking about a collection of kind of characteristics which can play different roles and importance depending on the context in which you're thinking about. So for some people, materiality might be in the foreground of your landscape. For other people, it might play the middle ground, or might even be right in the background. So it's a more way of kind of navigating this through an environmental metaphor than a kind of set of defining principles. So I'm just putting that up as a kind of, again, an extending idea of what we're thinking about when we're thinking about craft as an ethos, as much as a material practice. And I think we'll come back to those as we talk more. And the hiCraft project made a range of responses to issues to do with things like privacy and security, transparency, legibility, personal significance. We've made these, and again, going back to some of the conversations earlier, there's a ubiquity and standardization of both experience and form. And obviously we would like, craft, I would say, provides alternative visions, both in terms of the materials, but also in terms of the interactions that are embedded within the forms we've done. And we can, and as relevant, we can talk about them later, and you can come and see them in the show in the Learning Centre. So I'll leave that there, and I will hand over to Neha, who wants to talk about the context in India.
Hi, everyone. That's okay? Too low, too high? This is fine. Okay. Thank you, Justin. I thought, I could take you to India, a couple of 1,000 kilometers from here, and talk a little bit about what's happening in a small community, and perhaps many like that, in rural Karnataka. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit and see if we could find connections between that and some of the ethos and principles you were speaking about right now. And if we can draw inspiration between what's happening there and what we're talking about here in order to think about this healthy relationships between internet and people. So in India, we have this narrative of technology is doing good, it's successful, it's making a dent in the socioeconomic conditions of the country. But a lot of the times what we're also seeing out there is that it's urban-centric, and thus it ends up being narrow, and it's designed by a few people who are very far removed from the people who are using these technologies. I wanted to show this example. It's an instance of, this is a national initiative. It's called the Soil Health Initiative. The idea was to be able to take samples of farmer soils and to test them using quite quick technology that can be available very, very close to the farmers, and to create this sort of card that the farmers could then use to be able to think through what to grow and to be able to adapt. But what we see on the right-hand side of this card is a series of indicators like potassium, sulfur, zinc, which are all chemical indicators. They're correct. They're all appropriate. But they're not at all the indicators that a farmer thinks about as they think about their soil's health. Take, for instance, this person on the left. This is Achukagode. He is a farmer from the Soliga tribe in rural Karnataka. When we spoke to him and asked him, how does he measure the health of his soil? He said that he takes a small inch of soil and he's able to look at that and he's able to say by the number of earthworms that might be in the soil, by the moisture of the soil, by the saplings that might be there, by the seeds that might be there, if the soil is healthy or not. And that's a practice that his communities had for years. And that's something that they share as a language and as a way in which, and knowledge between all of the farmers, and are able to adapt to decide what it is that they need to grow, what is it that they need to change about it. And so something like the soil health card or an initiative of the scale just doesn't work for farmers out here. And that's just one of many, many instances. So if you flip it around and we kind of think about what would it take, how might we kind of acknowledge and recognize the experience and the expertise that people have, and how can we co-create or bring them in participation as we're designing things around emergent tech, around farming, around the sort of things that are there right now. And this is just a picture of one of the things we try to do. Some of us here have worked together on this, where we co-created with Achukagode and his community members what some of these emergent technologies might look like if they were to imagine these futures. And I just wanted to take you through a few examples really quickly. So this one's a coding kit. It's called the Children's Coding Kit, but it's meant to be used by anybody. Turns anyone, a farmer, a child, a young person who might be a youth in the community, into a sort of maker, hacker, and to be able to design the things they want to. One of the things in the kit is a microcomputer that is powered by speech. And the reason that the people who came up with that was because a lot of knowledge that's created and passed on and sent around and communicated is done orally. And so the idea of writing or being able to tap onto things is quite different. So it can be an experience, but it can also be something that's an interface or a language. So that's just one of those. Another one was a soil sensor. In this case, it's extremely localized and personalized to individual farmers and their different practices in a way in which it can learn from each of those farmers' practices and build on that. And as a response to the large technologies that are used for the agri-business, that scale of it, so as a kind of counter-narrative to that, this was one of the artifacts that came up. And then this is another one which was basically as we thought about these objects and we thought about the information and the data that's collected from these objects, the questions around who's the owner of that data, who's the owner of that information, how is it being negotiated and navigated came up. So on the left is ideas of a decentralized mesh system that the farmers would create using objects that are there around them. You can see in the left top this Bisleri bottle, because we'll have a lot of these and we already have them, can be used to create this small decentralized mesh network, and it could be spread around different villages, and farmers can decide between themselves what they want to share. If they wanted to open that up, they could get weather data, they could get crop data, and they could still keep it contained in some way. And on the right, you see a data custodian, quite kind of inspired by and borrowed by the local governance structures in India, which are called panchayats, but to be able to elect from within the community somebody and people, not just one person, who would be custodians of the data and would help sort of take decisions on what should happen to the data, when should it be shared, what should be shared, and is it within people's control to be able to share that. So yeah, I think I'll pause here right now and hand it off to Eke.
Thank you. Nice to talk about this all later. Let me open my notes just to give you a concise intro. So yeah, my lens on this topic is a social scientist. That's my background. So it's ethnography, cultural studies. But I'm also a design research practitioner. Service design, user-centered design. And I see a lot of connections with the hiCraft craft ethos from my work, so I'll try to make a connection there in these slides. So my agency, Standby, based in Amsterdam and London, we do projects where we look at how people use tech in their daily lives and also why they do that and what they appreciate about it. And usually there are stories when we go and visit people. So these are examples of people, their setup if they make like YouTube videos or podcasts. And if we talk about people, how they do that and why, and what they appreciate, it's a lot about making. It's about media making, crafting stories and sharing those stories and connecting with other people, local communities. At the same time, ourselves, as a design research team, we use a lot of gadgets as well. We love it. So before we go out to meet people, we prepare like a fieldwork pack. And we love trying new things out. But it's not about the tech, of course. It's about what we use it for. It's creating triggers and prompts to have a meaningful conversation with the people about why they make these stories and how they do it and how they connect with people. And we bring a lot of materials. So often it's maps or cards or modeling objects. And again, that is to trigger reflection, to trigger conversation and exploration, because often it's a meandering conversation where you gradually find out what the meaningful activities are and what drives people. Yeah, so that's the tools we use. And this is an example of some of our work. At the moment, we're in projects around repairability and maker spaces. And we meet a lot of people doing that, and we engage ourselves as well. So I'm in the pictures. This is a repair cafe in Amsterdam where I went with some clothes that I didn't want to lose, but they need some repair. It was really nice, and you really see a trend at the moment that more and more people engage with that out of drivers of being responsible around use of resources. But it's also about caring for things. It's caring for people, because they're very social spaces. So it's not just about creating or mending something. It's also about learning and growing as a person and about giving and taking, because you know something, you share that with some other, and somebody is teaching you that. So we see across these projects that the various ways of creating things and stories and slices of your life is very rooted in our everyday lives and cultures. And tech and internet are part and parcel of that. And that's a resource, you could say, a resource for learning, making, sharing, being responsible and resourceful. And these are some pictures of a new makerspace that has just been opened in a library in London. You see an interesting mix of technology, quite old school stuff, like sewing machines, I will say that wrong, knitting machines, but 3D printers, laser cutting and molding. And this doesn't come out of nowhere. Like fab labs and makerspaces have been around for 10, maybe 15 years, but for a long time it had been catering for quite a small subculture, and now it's opening up and the tech becomes more available, so it's more locally accessible for a wider group. And looking at that from my lens of a design research practitioner and a social scientist, we can recognize that, as you were saying, Justin, that people like to individualize things. So you use some existing things, but you personalize it for yourself to make it fit into your lives. And that's really a very active, and I would say a tactical attitude. That is to not just passively, as you said, consuming what industry offers to you. And that made me think back to a very seminal literature in my field, which is de Certeau, a practice of everyday life, who points out that, yes, we are in a mass industry and consumption culture, but we also have a tactical attitude of doing our own thing within there. And that is a very interesting distinction, and it's not, oh, this is good, that is bad. It's a mix of that, and that I find is a very useful framework to look at these kind of practices, and also to recognize that undercurrent, I would call it, as tactical, creative, critical way of making, is always there in every decade, but in different shapes or forms, and that gives hope. So if we find space for that, it will bloom, and it's there.
So my role really here is as a historian to say we've all been here before. So in that sense, don't panic, because we've got out of this before and maybe we can get out of it again. So I just wanted to place it in that sort of historical context. And it's really the context of the Industrial Revolution and thinking about what could be described as the great transformation that took place in the 18th and 19th century, where places like Sheffield, where I used to work, were transformed into places with a choking atmosphere, full of smoking chimneys, polluted rivers, degraded soil, and really the results of that initial runaway industrialization were disastrous. And not only from an environmental point of view, but also increasingly it was appreciated by commentators such as the famous poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, that people were being degraded by a runaway commercial entrepreneurial spirit. And by the 1820s, even a conservative critic like Coleridge was saying that commercial principles needed to be put in check, and arguing that the rise of the factory system had encouraged a mechanistic, a sort of quantitative view of life and of people that in a way reflects a lot of our anxieties about datafication now. So these concerns are not new concerns. They're concerns that have been there since the time of the Industrial Revolution, certainly. To some extent, I think Vladan's wonderful diagram, wonderful map, brings out the wide-ranging roots of that. And, of course, there was resistance, and most famously with the Luddites, which in modern traditional interpretation are seen as people hopelessly pitching themselves against an inevitable progress. But actually, the Luddites were different to that. They were people who believed in older forms of community control and community consensus about the implementation of technology and about the regulation of trade, and were using older forms of protest and resistance against that. So in a sense, they're actually reflecting community concerns at that point, many of which were rooted in the guild system, a system in the Middle Ages and the early modern period controlled the way in which trade developed and provided a fraternal structure whereby consensus could focus on the quality of trade, on the nature of the trade, rather than on sheer commercialism. I was very struck by the fact that John, in our earlier session, referred to bread. And of course, the bakers had guilds. And there's a very famous metaphor by Richard Hoggart in his book Uses of Literacy, in which he uses white sliced bread as a paradigm of commercialization and consumerism against the sort of old-fashioned craft of bread. And it was guilds that maintained the quality of bread. And that, I think, is a very helpful way of thinking about what we want to do with the internet. We want to turn the internet into something that is healthy bread, delicious bread, rather than white sliced bread, rather than ultra-processed bread. And the guilds were a structure for doing that. Do we need structures like that nowadays? And of course, these thoughts, this reaction, influenced people like William Morris, famously associated with the arts and crafts movement. But the interesting thing about Morris's vision of the collapse of manufacturing districts, the removal of the pollution that we saw in places like Sheffield, was that he saw it as disappearing completely and being replaced. It was a sort of a complete split, so that you either had an arts and crafts movement looking back to the medieval period, or you had manufacture. And he dreamt of the destruction of the manufacturing districts. There wasn't any kind of accommodation. And I think that's a big issue. The split between the culture, the view of culture that was distant from manufacturing, and the view of arts and crafts that were a reaction against it. And Morris's vision of machines ceasing to be used because people realized that they couldn't produce beautiful things kind of fits in with that. And craft, in his view, rises because we realize the limitations of machines. And I think that tension is relevant to our discussion today in the sense that we possibly want to think more about how we actually have an accommodation between craft and machines, between craft and technology. And that might be something that we want to think about in our discussion. To go back to Sheffield, very interesting situation in Sheffield during the Industrial Revolution is that the small little meisters, as they call them there, the small craftsmen who produced cutlery, tools, actually continued to adopt very old-style craft methods of working. But the possibilities of industrialization through having extra light, better water supply, mechanization of some basic tasks, better distribution through the railways, transformed the environment in which that craft was undertaking. And maybe we need to think about something similar today in the way in which we're viewing craft, and to actually take the example of the little meisters to heart. I'll come back to Coleridge to end with, because I was very struck by Coleridge's discussions in 1817, which seemed to me to speak to some of the problems that we have now. That we must think about what that regulation of these large capitalistic extractive monopolies might look like and how we cope with that. That's difficult in an internet world because of the international structure of them. But it's interesting that they were thinking about that even in 1817. Education, we've already mentioned. And Coleridge, again, emphasized the importance of education, not just in learning to code, but also in the quality of what we do on the internet. The culture of what we should do on the internet should reflect that. And within that, we should think about the morality and the ethics of what we do in the internet. And all of us can contribute to that. And to some degree, I think we can argue that in facing up to the Industrial Revolution, the whole of society contributed to getting out of that. Maybe we could think about something similar with the internet. So that's my kind of feeling that we've been there before and maybe we can get out of it now. Craft was certainly an issue then, but it needs to perhaps be a restated craft. And I think the hiCraft project is very interesting from that point of view. So now we'll, having laid out our wares, as it were, we'll consider that from a different point of view. One thing about thinking about this sort of British tradition, which I'd be interested in Niha's view on, is that is very much from the point of view of what's happening in Britain. But it seems to me that when one looks beyond the mainstream European countries, there are very interesting things going on, particularly in India in terms of craft. What sort of lessons does that sort of working up that from the bottom that you described have for us in Europe now, do you think?
It's difficult because I'm probably practicing it, but not so much historically kind of in a thing of it. But I'll take a shot at this. I think it's an interesting place at this time because it's not as though the things that we're talking about here in technology are not happening there. But I think that we've got counter narratives that are happening at the same time. And I think that we're just, because of the counter narratives and the current narratives being together at the same time, one, they give us a chance to contrast and to think about how would we do it differently, and trying to do it differently and not trying to accept what's traditionally been from this side of the world in some way. And it's interesting because even in technology, for instance, to take an example about money right now, and we've been working, or I've been researching for about 2 years, digital financial inclusion, which is an important aspect of bringing people into being banked and financially included into society. One of the things that we're discovering is that in that side of the world, it's actually driving the change right now and is innovating and is presenting the challenges just because of how people are, what they do, how culturally they're different to this side of the world. So actually it's much, much ahead, it's much more complex, and it's much more driven. And that's just one analogy I'm drawing to a technology project. But just to say that I think there's more to be drawn, and craft, again, craft as an object and a process still exists, and it has its challenges. There's a lot that gets discussed out there about the challenges of craft and keeping it alive. But I think as an ethos, which is what we're talking about here, it's quite ingrained in the everyday practices of not just rural, but urban folks as well. And I think it gives us a chance to just think differently in some way.
Yeah, I have a thought, maybe not so much getting back to your talk, because I can't talk for India, of course. But I'm intrigued by you were saying, yes, we've been here before. Agree?
Yeah.
I'm not sure about can we get out of it? And there I connect back to Vladan's introduction as well. We've been there before in different ways.
Yep.
It's different, and we can do our best to change things, but some things we've not come out of the industrial decade.
No, I know
but
that's true.
Some things are better now,
Yeah.
but some things haven't changed. So I think our discussion now would benefit from looking at within some things that change gradually, but don't disappear completely. How can we do meaningful change and respectful and ethical, and acknowledge pockets of change that are very positive? And I think there that tactical, strategic can help, and looking at that undercurrent, or what did you say, the counter narrative, because the counter narratives are there, and that's important, I think. But then to think, oh, because now then we can finally get out of it, that's the thing I find difficult as a
Yes,
social scientist.
and I was thinking during Amy's presentation in our first session about, I've recently been reading about something very dear to the heart of William Morris, the preservation of Epping Forest in the northeast of London, which was very much under threat from building development in the late 19th century. And there was this huge national campaign to actually save that from building development. And that was successful. But you look at it now and it seems comparatively small scale success. It was a good success. And it's a success that's starting to look a little bit more under threat again now, even though the forest is controlled safely by the Corporation of London. But it still looks a little more threatened. But that was big for London then. How does one scale it up? That's part of the problem. Is we're dealing with social, cultural, and political issues on an international scale now. How do we actually approach the scale? How do we scale up what we're doing?
Well, taking the cue from that, rewilding was mentioned as well in the first panel. I think that's super interesting. And that's not coming out of nowhere. That's been a discussion that's been going on also for decades already, and where we can really learn from ecologists. So I studied social scientists, but I'd like to have studied ecology because that's a long-term way of looking at change, and also acknowledging that there's different, I'm not sure if you can call it power structures, but different structures at place. Some are destructive and some are generative, and we need to acknowledge that and can't control that and give it space and be patient as well. We can't completely control it. I think we can learn a lot in this conversation around internet and tech and ethos about learning more from ecology and nature. And that, coming back to your Epping Forest, yes, that's long ago. And maybe it was a small thing, but it's a pocket of resistance and meaningful discourse that may have led into, over decades, in this conversation that is leading us now to talk about rewilding the internet, because that's a word we wouldn't have used maybe 10 years ago in terms of technology.
It relates to, again, what we were talking about earlier, and I think it's very key, because I think there's an element of that, as Vlad's wonderful diagram illustrates, at the heart of the internet, this idea of property rights and extraction, which is what a lot of the debate about common lands in England in the 19th century was around, that these medieval rights meant that certain lords could claim that they could have complete control of the whole property, and there was a resistance to that. And that, so there, again, there's a very strong analogy there that I think that we could take to heart.
I think just to go back to the point you made, or the question you asked about scale, and I was thinking about the word scale. Somewhere it feels a bit that it already comes with a certain baggage of the existing kind of what scale does for the sake of efficiency, for the sake of something. And we see a lot of things, I think, in that map that talk about bringing it down to a certain level of efficiency because we wanted to attempt scale. But what if we were to think about decentralized scale? What if we were to think about an idea of it happening in different places, but scaled together, still connected? But could it be local? Could it be quite rooted in the ambitions of those people and their idea of scale and what they wanted it to be, rather than a larger scale? I mean, it's just a thought. I don't have the answer, but just a
I think there the ecology comes in as well.
Exactly.
Because that's nature, right? It's super scale, but it's also about this farmer with this bit of soil in his hands and the plant. And it's about sometimes, nurturing, but also accepting things that are bigger than you.
And it goes back to, for those that are here earlier, this concept of millions of tens rather than tens of millions. It's like, if you talk about, scale as like, how do we confront scale? Well, who is benefiting from this scale the most? And it isn't the individual user. That's not, and I think thinking about these different models of like, is that the only thing, and I think it also ties back to the arts and crafts movement and thinking about, we define ourselves of like the benefits to the consumer. Well, the arts and crafts movement was trying to hold the flag for the producer, the meaningfulness of labor and work, and define ourselves through that rather than as the consumer that's getting the cheapest possible product, the easiest possible way, which again is something that is thought to be a kind of baseline kind of aspiration for any kind of experience, whether that's digital or physical product. And I think in reframing that, and then that goes back to the makerspaces and the idea of being a maker, being someone who actually has an active part and all the meaningfulness that comes from that. And that's not just traditional crafts. People that do creative tech, John and many other people would say, they have a craft of doing creative programming or tech. It's not a kind of saying, if you're not a potter, you're not a craftsman. It's a much more inclusive kind of definition of that. And so I think there is this kind of finding strategies for finding meaning in making as well as meaning in a kind of consumption.
Can I ask about, there's an interesting maybe tension between scale and localism. Because a lot of craft, it happens in your repair shop or in your whatever workshop you have, and then it's meaningful. Maybe that person or that group of people don't care about scale. So what does scale matter? Maybe yes, if it's about conditions or facilities. It's nice if it's available for everyone, so that it's decentrally available, but maybe scale doesn't work as a term for that analogy.
But again, in the sort of productive thing, this idea that Adam was talking about, the factory in a very broad terms, it's like, well, the factory is the one model and it has a certain set of kind of things that drives it as a model of success. Well, the workshop and the craft workshop has got a different, I think, set of things, and it also has different relationships with materials. And I don't think it has got this same, again, the commodification that Amy talked about earlier in trees. It's like, I think a lot of people that are makers, they don't see material as a resource, as a kind of something to exploit, but they see it as something to partner with in order to create something. And they have a very, intimate relationship with that materials that not necessarily extractive. So I think these things kind of circulate.
And from a historical perspective, I can't never resist getting onto James Watt. It must be because I'm from the University of Glasgow. One of my best 3D printing experiences was to 3D print a bust of James Watt from a mould in the Science Museum during a workshop that we had in Glasgow, which was great fun. But in terms of the factory system, Watt worked out his improvements in the steam engine in Glasgow, but he couldn't take them forward because there weren't enough craftsmen to actually develop the parts sufficiently well in Scotland. And it was only when he went to Birmingham and hooked up with Matthew Bolton that he could find the craft expertise that could actually build the engines. And the factory system, which they then pioneered, was actually built on that original craft expertise. So there's not necessarily that tension between them. Shall we move on to some questions and invite any questions or comments on that? We have a roving mic, I believe. So are there any? I can't see any hands waving aloft at present. Do please pitch in. Yes, gentleman here.
Thank you for the conversation so far. Very inspiring. I'm kind of wondering, in our kind of transition to a more circular economy and society, what would be the role of craft in there? I haven't heard too much about it yet, so I'm curious what the panel thinks.
I can try answering that. Can I skip slides a little bit? Just as a picture I thought I could show right now. So I was trying to put pictures together, but then we had this thing of let's keeps some in the back for later. So this is one of those, what is this idea of what is technology? And when we're talking about the internet right now and things, when we go to a context like the village where the farmers are working, this is technology. And it's open in the sense that they're able to, it breaks, and they're able to fix this, and they're able to modify this for the things they want to use it for. And because it's made out there, there's also the culture of repair out there. So, can't play. Do it the other way around.
Is there another one after here?
It must be easier like this. The clicker didn't work, sorry. Yeah, so this is a place where the farming sickles are being made, but this person's not just making it. Right now they're making and forging it, but when the sickle breaks or it's not sharp anymore, they'll come back to this place, they'll melt that out, they'll fix that thing. And there are places like this for these tools right now and these technologies, but when we think about the phones and the sort of things that are out there, we don't have repairs for them. Those shops don't exist here. But this does, and so I'm just trying to make that connection between craft as we know it and some of these technologies that are open and the culture of, or the practice of the people around, the ecosystem of repairing and fixing and reusing, and the idea of jugaad, the idea of being able to make things and fix things on your own, and how can, if there were ways in which to even apply it to phones, to apply it to something else that we're talking about right now.
Yeah, I think so. Also in the interest in repairability and makerspaces, there's a lot of attention for interest in being responsible resources, which is strongly connected with circularity and slowing down, caring for things, and sort of meaningful use of things. So there's definitely strong connections, I think. It's not a surprise that there's so much interest in it now in the context of climate urgency. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure quite how much this relates, but I think in a lot of practices of craft, there's a two-handedness, both literary and kind of more metaphorically, is they try and, there's a tradition of working with local materials, there's a tradition of thinking about what can be done in the situations you find itself, rather than a kind of economic or a productive model that goes, okay, the world's my resource in terms of labour and materials, and I will go to where it is most cheap and efficient to make things or to get the materials. I think craft, probably just because it's not a very big economy, it hasn't scaled in that way. It's like, what have I got to hand? And that both, I think, creates the nature of the objects in terms of their forms and their materialities, and a kind of a frame of mind that isn't about where can I go to extract things most effectively.
Question here.
I actually just wanted to pick up on what you were talking about, because, 20 years ago now, there was a local food movement. And I think that still is a thing, and you increasingly see people who, myself included, we choose, I'm not going to buy green beans from Peru. I'm going to have something else. And maybe we need a local movement for manufactured objects as well, which would then potentially favor local craft, rather than, I'm thinking particularly in terms of clothing and textile, which used to be intensely local. You used to be able to identify somebody from what they were wearing, because that textile or that style or that was local to where they came from. And now, of course, I'm sitting here wearing a jacket from India, which I only just realized. So maybe we need to pick up that fairly successful movement for food in terms of the material world. I don't know.
And it's actually about developing knowledge of what crafts are appropriate to particular areas, and maybe looking at how they developed. I used to subscribe to I live in the Lee Valley in London, which was for a long time London's sort of market garden, and was a terrific area for cultivation of fruit and veg. which fizzled out. There's a local firm for me called The Organic, which is trying to revive that market garden tradition and will deliver food grown locally as weekly baskets. But I didn't know until I came across them that that was part of the history of the area. And maybe there are crafts in other areas that we've forgotten about, and we could actually hope to develop. So I think that's another aspect of localism we could think about.
Just very quickly, to be the cynical craftsperson, it's like, absolutely, yes, we do sign up to the local food co-op and go, do we get sick of Swede in February? Too right we do. You know, there is this issue of kind of, yes, we are in a position now where we have to think quite hard about what is that kind of the global offer that is so seductive and how you manage that. And I think the sort of things that we've done in hiCraft and are going to do a little bit more of, that when we're talking about local things, is making something very simple, but hopefully kind of useful and sort of things that could be made locally, although you are invariably importing aspects of the technology. But it would be interesting to know if when you try that at scale or more than a research project, of like whether you reach the Swede point quite quickly.
I'm quite intrigued by your comment, because I think in food that has indeed happened, but gradually. I remember for myself, personally, first I was aware of fair trade, and I was, buy this coffee, not that coffee. Then it was organic and being vegetarian, but Food Miles was news to me. That only came later, and Food Miles has really stuck. People look at how far, as you were mentioning, has this avocado traveled, and shall I buy it or not? I think product miles might be an interesting construct, and maybe not everybody takes up on it, but some people would be interested. But I also wanted to say that we see it a little bit happening in building. So if people care about sustainable building, there's definitely a big interest in that the materials can be local. For instance, for insulating your walls, it can be straw or hay, what's the word? Local materials. And there's quite a strong emerging industry there as well.
I suppose part of what I was trying to say was that the internet can actually be a tool for enabling us to be more aware of local traditions and of product miles and so on, so that the environment can help us in different directions. Any other questions? There's a question up here.
Hello, hi. I just wanted to know that from your work and your research, has a factor of age also played a difference? Have you seen a difference in how older people perceive this problem versus how younger people do it?
Interesting question. Yes and no. For instance, if you go to repair cafes, it's not just young people, but statistically, it's a larger contingent of young people taking up on these sort of new ideas. But definitely, you can't make it simple, as in, it's always young people, because it's a mindset, right? It's also how you were educated and what kind of social group you have around you, and that's independent of age. You carry that with you. So, yes and no. You can put a lens on and see some indication of that, but I don't think you can make a big statement out of it. No. I don't know. Would have to look into your study, but sometimes it doesn't help to make it as simple as that, as in, oh, younger people do this, older people do. You can make a statement about it, well, what's the point of it really? Because there's probably easy to find a lot of older people who contradict this and younger people who contradict it. So I'm not sure.
I can only offer some anecdotal evidence. I've recently moved into a retirement complex. I have one of the younger people there, I hasten to add. But I'm on our residents association, and when we distribute papers for the residents association, a third of the people, of the 70 people on in my complex, don't have internet access. And I find it amazing to imagine how these lively older people manage to get along without internet access, but they're quite happy to do so and continue much as they've always done, quite happily.
Have you asked them if they never had internet, or have they said no more?
No, they've never had it. It quite surprises me. These are quite lively and intelligent people. Final question. I think we've time for a final question at the back there.
I'd like to play the I'd like to provoke you guys a little bit with the following. Isn't this idea of internet craftsmanship a bit contradictory? I mean, of course it's possible. I mean, you can also do some knitting while you're jumping out of a plane. You know, it's absolutely possible, but the limitations of the internet, for example, on the internet, it's sensorially deficient. There's no smell, there's no texture. The way the internet sort of encourages a sort of addictive quality, the way the tools and platforms tend to be runaway capitalism and exploitative, the way it promotes distraction, the way we're trained to see, you know, when we work with the screen, we expect distraction. We're grooved in that direction. So in a way, the idea of internet craftsmanship sounds great to me, but by the time we change the internet to really make it possible, we shouldn't even call it the internet anymore. It would be something completely different.
As we're approaching the end of this, I think we have to hear the word from Justin as the progenitor of hiCraft on that.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, those are a very eloquent list of all the things that we were trying to respond to. And again, going back to the first talk, it's not like this is some sort of replacement thing. It's not like it's just going, there are other ways. And I think the sorts of, if you want to, I can quickly scroll back through. It's way back. Here we go. So the slightly strange range of things that we've kind of created as speculative stuff are suggesting that instead of going, oh yeah, the digital is this, it has to be this, it's making things that go, oh, what happens if it's just one-to-one? That's all it'll ever do. What happens if you make something, you know, in some people's cases, that's doing a connection with someone that isn't even there anymore? Or what happens if you create a network that is entirely off the internet but connects three people in a way that is quite novel, stripped down, but finds meaning in other ways that aren't based on those sort of models of kind of addiction and kind of pulling you into those sorts of experience because they're the model of which I think Vladan kind of set within a bigger historical context. So yes, I don't think we're not sort of suggesting a kind of utopian replacement. We're just going, if you put a different lens on it, it hopefully gives you ways to think about stuff, which again, linking back to the previous talk, are kind of our final aspiration, utopian as it is to go, you know what, these sorts of experiences and through making these things and living with them allows you to think differently, which then allows you to drive discussions about policy, which could then have the potential for changing some of the underlying infrastructures and algorithms that generate the sorts of problems. So that will be my utopian response.
Connecting to that, I think so too. All the things you mentioned as bad things, yeah, they're there. But I think it doesn't help to say that's all bad and that all need to go and then only we have something good. It also helps, and I find that tactical, strategic lens helps to see in that all bad, there's also good things happening. And I think if we look back at, if we could say you can also do coding as a craft, open source, Arduino. It started as people tinkering with stuff, but it has really made a change. And it hasn't done away with the bad internet, but there's been positive change, and it really stuck. So I think it helps us to look at that rather than, oh, bad, and it's only bad, and we need the only good, because centuries have taught us that that's not how it is. It's a mix, and that mix changes over time, and we need to look at the meaningful pockets of change.
Well, yeah, I'm afraid we haven't quite managed to recraft the internet totally in the time available to us. Time has run out. So I'd ask you to, first of all, thank my fellow panelists, and also thank Mark and the Digital Design Week team, the V&A support for their splendid help. Thank you for coming. And as we now finish this session, I'd also urge you to go back down to the Learning Centre, look at the terrific hiCraft objects on display there, and enjoy the rest of the Digital Design Weekend. Thank you very much for coming.